Hello everyone, welcome back to Religion, Sex, and Politics. Today I'd like to talk to you briefly about the issue of casualties in Ukraine, specifically military losses. If you've been watching news reports in Ukraine, you're probably under the impression that Russia has been suffering massive casualties, while Ukraine has been doing comparably rather well. But I'd like to dispel a couple of myths here in this video. First is this whole idea that Russia is suffering massive military losses in Ukraine. And as a corollary to that, I'd like to explain how Ukraine is actually suffering far more losses than the media is letting on. Now, how do we know about how many Russian losses there are in the war? Now, like I said, if you've been listening to the news, you'd think that tens of thousands of Russians have been killed in this war. I think there's even some reports that try to say that somewhere of 100,000 Russians have been killed or injured over the course of this war since last February. Well, at the highest estimates that the Russians even had in Ukraine is about 150,000 soldiers. So I don't know where anyone would think that 2/3 of the Russian troops that have gone into Ukraine have suffered, either killed in action or wounded in action. In fact, there's a fairly easy means that we can evaluate Russian losses, especially those killed in action. And actually, it's so commonsensical that the British media already did it. You see, if a Russian soldier is killed in battle, his body is taken back to Russia, sent to his family, where he will then be prepared for burial and a funeral. Now, if you've ever known someone who's died, usually when they die, you can go online and read their obituary. And so the British media actually began researching obituaries in the papers and in the media outlets in Russia. And they discovered that, I believe it's around a little bit above or below 10,000 obituaries for Russian soldiers killed in the war in Ukraine. So when we hear 100,000 dead Russians in Ukraine, it really is laughable, because when you look at the papers themselves, when you look at the actual numbers of dead from the obituaries from families whose loved ones have died in Ukraine, we know that it's somewhere around 10,000. Now, typically, you have a person that dies, you'll have two people that are wounded. So we could probably fairly safely estimate that Russia suffered around 10,000 killed in Ukraine and maybe 20,000 wounded. So I think using this common sense method of evaluating Russian losses, we can be pretty confident that the Russian losses are nowhere near as the media lets on. Another reason why we can be sure that Russian losses in Ukraine have been lower than what we hear is because so much of the infantry fighting taking place in Ukraine has been conducted by the militias of the Donbass. This is the breakaway region in eastern Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk. They've created their own militaries, and much of the fighting in those areas, which is where some of the heaviest fighting of the war has been, that's been conducted by infantrymen of those militias, of those people's republics, not as much so the Russian Federation. We've also seen a lot of heavy fighting from Chechen infantrymen and also different mercenary groups like the Wagner Group. So these non-Russian armed forces have been fighting fairly fiercely in Ukraine, but these are not infantry of the Russian armed forces itself. So what about the Ukrainian military? Well, I think it's fairly safe to estimate the dead and the wounded of the Ukrainian military as well over 100,000. Now you might wonder, how could that be so high if the Russian losses are so low? And the answer is that so many of Ukraine's casualties in the war thus far have not come from hand-to-hand combat with an enemy soldier, or even from a firefight with pistols and rifles near each other in the streets. No, Ukraine has suffered losses because of Russia's use of long-range firepower. This means Russia, which has at least a 15-to-1 advantage in terms of artillery, is able to shell Ukrainian positions and hit Ukrainian soldiers from afar. So using artillery, using airstrikes, using missiles, using drones, even using tanks and other vehicles, Russian forces are able to inflict losses on the Ukrainian army far outpacing those that the Ukrainian army can do in return, because the Russians have an advantage in terms of long-range firepower. Now, this has been recently multiplied given the fact that Ukraine has been launching repeated counteroffensives or attempts at counteroffensives. Now, where the Russians have decided to hold their ground, like in Kherson, the Ukrainians have run headlong into massive Russian firepower. And this firepower is inflicting massive amounts of casualties on the Ukrainian military. We've heard reports even in the mainstream media about how Ukraine is suffering 5-to-1 losses in some of these offensives. And it's likely that they've even suffered worse than that. Meanwhile, when the Russians understand that they're in a position that they cannot hold, they withdraw in good order, bringing their men, their weapons, and their materials with them, thus saving them from being captured or killed at the hands of the Ukrainian military. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't Russian forces that are getting killed and that there's absolutely no Russian equipment that's being captured, but the numbers are quite low compared to what we see on the Ukrainian side. So to sum this up, the best forensic accounts that we can see in Russia points to a rather low fatality rate of Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Meanwhile, we see that the Ukrainians are suffering massive losses, not because they're engaged in hand-to-hand combat or a firefight with Russian troops. No, they're being killed by long-range firepower that the Russians have and the Ukrainians lack. So contrary to what the news is telling us, Russia is not suffering the kinds of losses that we're hearing in the news, while Ukraine, on the other hand, is suffering far higher losses than anything we've heard so far. All that being said, Ukraine does have one massive advantage. It outnumbers Russian forces in Ukraine by a factor of 8-to-1. Given that number, it wouldn't surprise me at all to see some more Ukrainian advances. But as Russia brings hundreds of thousands of new troops to the line, I think we're going to see a change in Ukraine, and it could happen very, very soon. Thanks so much for watching Religion, Sex, and Politics. We look forward to seeing you in our next video.